time to go over the fabulous local dishes, but I think there's so many that we can't get like all of the recipes. But if we could like call out some of the local ingredients that were in those dishes.
Apple.
Apples.
Broccoli.
Broccoli.
Eggs.
Eggs.
Red pepper. Garlic.
Milk. Delicata.
Bean. Scapes.
Potatoes.
Scapes. Winter squash.
Woo! What a cornucopia! And we brought it together and are nourishing each other. So we've got a fantastic program tonight. Our guests are here, and all of our guests are here, including, we are guests to each other. But just for those of you who haven't been here before, the idea of Transition Dummerston is that we're part of an international network of communities who are focused on building resilience for meeting the challenges of climate change and energy depletion and difficulties. There's some arguments about whether we're completely at peak oil, but we're certainly at the peak of oil that's easy to get, and some problems there, and also economic disruption, and really focusing on building our relationships and developing our skills so that we can support each other and live well in these interesting times that we're in. So that's the basic idea, and this is about we started in January, and we've been meeting about once a month. Many of you have been here again and again, and we're so glad. And Fred has a little report on one of our first major projects.
It seems since tonight's topic is apples, and apples are a good, wonderful thing to eat, that we want to tell you a little bit about our first major summer project this year, which involved food. We called it Share Our Surplus, and the Garden Surplus Exchange. And the idea was that everybody in their gardens has stuff that gets out of control, whether it's zucchinis at the end of the summer, or strawberries at the beginning of the summer, or anything in between. And so we set up a plan whereby people could leave off vegetables, fruit in 3 locations around Dummerston: the KOA campground, right over here at the town hall, and the community center in West Dummerston. And over the course of the last, about 6 weeks, I guess, we've had a pretty steady flow of fruits and vegetables. And what hasn't been taken by anybody who came by and wanted to take it home, we ended up taking to the drop-in center. So it ended up being food that was contributed to the food shelf at the drop-in center in Brattleboro. So we've just wrapped up. We decided that our gardens had finally died for the year. But we felt like it was a great way to start out building community through sharing food resources. And so we'll be looking forward to getting that going again next year, and we'll have more to say about that as we get on into the winter.
Carry on. Oh, you're going to announce it first. Okay.
Yeah, I'll just send this around. Since we do have some expenses, and we don't have any regular source of income, we appreciate donations to help us with everything from food rentals when we have movies to show to so anything that you can contribute is welcome. It's great. Thanks.
So, welcome, Diana.
I did want to mention that I grew up actually on a farm in Pennsylvania. I was
Close.
originally in California, but Pennsylvania was where I grew up on a small family farm, actually. Main item was flowers, but lots of vegetables. And we used to actually give away 10 pounds of potatoes with every $5 purchase, so you can tell what the economics were at that time. So I also wanted to say that I loved how you all called out the vegetables and the ingredients, the milk and everything. It was sort of a litany of all our local products that we can produce in our community. And the reason why I connect that with my poem is that the poem started out as just sort of a journal entry, and I do journaling quite a bit from time to time, mostly in the winter when things are a little slow in my life. But I introduced the names of heirloom apples after I had written this poem, and I felt like there was something missing, but that litany of the vegetables and the litany of the different heirloom apples made sense to me, and it brought the whole poem alive for me, because it was about the apple. It is about the apple. The poem is called Dreaming of Apples, and it's really about anticipating the harvest, having to wait through all of the winter, all of the spring, and all of the various things that my husband has to do in the orchard. He's very active all winter, pruning. But we're all waiting for those apples in the fall, and that's like almost a whole cycle, 9 months of waiting. That's a lot of waiting. So this is an inspiration of that waiting. Dreaming of apples. I dream of apples like some people dream of money, love, and success. I desire apples, round, glistening, and scented like a mountain morning, a treasure chest of garnets, rubies, and golden globes of perfect fruit. Hudson's golden gem, black Oxford, Roxbury russet. I dream of apples in the winter when the world is sleeping. Apples, the trees pruned before the arrival of the carnival of beehives. The colored boxes like flags alert our bear of a dog to beware. I dream of apples in the spring when apple blossoms shiver, shaking their pink confetti over intoxicated bees buzzing, careening in frantic circuitry of beelines to flowers soft with pollen. In summer, the fruit grows plump like well-fed children, napping in the sun, cheeks flushed from the exertion of ripening. I dream of their fruition, and my desire for apples grows stronger. Sheep's nose, blue pearmain, Hubbardston nonsuch. I dream that the fruit will bear me to ecstasy, to pie, perchance to dream of more voluptuous fruit, the sweet tart crunch of taut apple flesh. In fall, the trees beckon with perfumed temptation, their apples overbearing, overwhelming. Holstein, Esopus, maiden's blush. Dreaming of apples, only the harvest means anything to me. This is for Zeke. And I wanted to say that none of these apples are a part of that poem, unfortunately. But I was asked to talk about what apples I bake with. And really, it's about whatever Zeke says is a good idea. He is tasting apples all season, and as the season goes, different apples are ripening. So right now, he was suggesting to me to do a northern spy, which is from the 1830s. And it's, these are tart apples. I wouldn't recommend really eating these, out of hand. They're really for baking. Some people do, but...
The spy is quite sweet this year.
Yeah.
Really? Oh, that's another thing I should say, yeah. That actually it's hard, it's very confusing, I think, this year because the apples did shift. So this is sweet this year. Normally very tart for apple pie making. And Cabelle Blanc de Verre is a French cooking apple from 1500s, 1600s. And this is very tart still, is it?
It's not tart.
Not too tart?
No.
No? Okay. Because normally it would be, wouldn't it? Or is it?
Somewhat.
Okay, somewhat.
That's
Okay.
sweet.
It's good that he's here because I don't think especially this year is very different with the taste.
Its texture is good, the cooking. It has a certain amount of acidity
Okay.
and almost a champagne flavor. A little hint of vanilla, and then the champagne flavor.
Oh, yes. So that brings me to the fact that I do not put any spice in the apple pie because these flavors, especially this flavor, is going to come through. So I know a lot of folks put cinnamon, cloves, and I used to do that because I think with some traditional apples, traditional in the sense of American, more recent, the apples just don't have that much flavor and you want to add spice. But a lot of the apples that Zeke is growing really have their own spice to them. In particular, sheep's nose is a spicy apple. Well, I don't know, a lot of them have different flavors. I mean, reindeer, reinette. I mean, I'm looking to Zeke because really I've been confused. He actually stumped me this year. I have to mention a story where he brought I thought was my favorite apple home, which is the Hudson Golden Gem, which is in my poem. And it tastes a little pear-like, and it's a wonderful, beautiful golden apple. So he brought this apple home, about this size, not this apple, but it looked just like a Hudson Golden Gem. I proceeded to taste it. I was very excited. Turned out it was a Roxbury russet, and I was totally confused because the color, it really looked like a Hudson Golden Gem. And then there was a couple of other apples I think I got confused because the flavor is changed by that we had the cold weather, then the warm weather, and then, anyway, it was up and down, and it was a lot of long, warm weather, and so the flavor changed. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to pretty much just show you my pie, but then lead into Zeke because really he's going to tell you about maybe the weather, how it's affected the apples, and also the economics and just whatever they've asked you to talk about.
Right, that's what I'll talk about.
But anyway, so this is an apple that I'll just pass it around so you can, or I'll just pass it around. But you can smell it. It just was baked. And again, you'll see I leave the peels on because I want to see the color and the flavor. There's some flavor in there and fiber and vitamins and minerals.
In the skin.
In the skin, yeah. So the skins are all kept on, so you get a really rustic looking pie. It's not peeled at all.
Beautiful.
Oh. For the viewers at home. Is that good? Oh, there you go.
So why no top crust?
Well, who suggested I do that? And I found that it's faster and it's prettier. And it's really fast.
And it doesn't dry out?
It can dry out, but you're usually eating it so quickly.
Yeah.
Well, no, I mean dry out in the oven without a...
Oh, in the oven? No, plenty of butter.
Oh, butter. Butter. Because that's why I put a top crust on to keep it moist.
Yeah, no, I think what we do is a lot of butter, and you can throw a little water or milk in there, but I just put a lot of butter. And we usually eat it so quickly, and it's great with whipped cream. Did you get a chance?
Without ice cream pop either, huh?
Ice cream, whipped cream. So it's going to moisten right up, but it does dry out a little bit. It makes it really easy to eat, sort of like a pizza. Oh, so good. Yeah.
It's not hard to eat.
So I would never have baked this way, except for Zeke's suggestions.
It appears to have two types of apples in it, does it?
Like more than
Yes,
that.
it does. It has the Cavell Blanc de Ville
It has
and what's nice is the two apples have different colored skin. So I spent a lot of time sort of, okay, I want a red one here, and depending. And the thing is you can do more than two apples. So you can get a third color, say a nice brown russeted apple. And so you get this, and so when you bite into it, you're biting into a little different flavor, as you go. It's not all one apple. And it's kind of fun.
So Diana,
Creative.
do you have any other apple poems? It's sort of in the works, or?
Well, I've written 5 other apple poems, and I've actually applied for a grant to do a whole book. So I'm kind of excited. And if I don't get the grant, I'll still do the book. So I'm not inspired by the heirloom apples. I mean, there's Shakespeare, there's Adam and Eve. There's so much metaphor, and it's really the basis of a lot of what we do. I think apples are a pretty significant part of our history. From the Roxbury russet being our first apple in American history, and the story of Johnny Appleseed, and cider being the beverage of the colonists. I mean, it's a pretty important food product that we're producing. So I'm pretty inspired.
Thank you, Diana.
Thank you.
I was asked to talk about the economics of orchards. And if you're familiar with the dairy industry, while much more publicized and orcharding, are very similar. They're both commodity crops. You know, the farmers are producing a very perishable commodity that has a very limited storage life. And in most cases, the farmers aren't the ones setting the price. The price is set by stores or other forces outside off the farm. And the history of dairying and orcharding follows similar lines, where the smaller dairies producing their milk and shipping it by train, or producing butter and cheese that could then be sent to the cities, and eventually becoming more centralized, and milk being shipped to a dairy processor, and the trucks coming and picking up the milk, and the bulk tank history. Orchards follow pretty much the same sort of history, where orchards tended to be smaller, and but with refrigeration and maybe around the middle part of the last century, they tended to become larger, but also more centralized, where about that time, there arose what were called commission houses, where Fred Holbrook and his father Cabot were J.P. Sullivan orchardists, and they shipped their apples to J.P. Sullivan in Ayer, Massachusetts, and then they would distribute them and sell them and do all the marketing. And so orchardists pretty much just became, growers, and left the selling of the crop to someone else. And that became more centralized, sort of like the bulk tanks. The Holbrooks and I think the Millers here in town would pack the apples at the farm for J.P. Sullivan, or Storm King, I think was the distributor that the Millers used, and ship them to be distributed. And they'd package in J.P. Sullivan boxes or Storm King boxes. The commission houses would take a commission and return a certain amount per bushel back to the grower. Eventually, the packing houses or the commission houses decided that for efficiency, they needed to package the fruit themselves. And so the trucks would come and you'd load just the bins of apples onto the trucks, and they'd be taken down to Ayer, Massachusetts, to a large processing facility. And the farms would be charged for, the trucks coming and taking the fruit, and then the fruit being unloaded and put into storage, and then taken out of storage and run down a packing line, and the packaging and the boxes, and then, of course, the commission for selling the fruit. And so you could end up losing money on a bushel of apples because all of these charges, and then if you had less than perfect fruit, they would charge you all of these processing costs and trucking costs, and the price that they would pay you for a box of cull fruit or cider fruit were really just pennies a pound. So you could, in some cases, in the late 80s and early 90s, sometimes farms were owing the packing houses money by the end of the season. It was lots of orchards were downsizing or going out of business. And what was happening was some orchards, just like some dairies, that began to process their own milk, make yogurt or cheese. Some orchards began to do value-added products, or to take over, to keep the crop on their farm and sell it themselves, or like the Millers, they became certified organic, and that gave them an edge on the market. I'm an orchard manager, which means sort of like a baseball manager. I go from team to team, whoever wants to hire me. And my expertise is in growing these old apples and selling them. So, successful orchards now really have had to find a niche, where they can have some special edge on the market. It used to be in the 1980s, when I was getting started at this, I could call a store, a produce manager at a store, and I could tell them that I had Macintosh apples. And they would tell me the price that they would pay me, and I couldn't tell them the price that I wanted, because there'd be 3 or 4 other orchards trying to call the same produce manager and sell their crop. No orchard has enough storage to keep their entire crop, just like no dairy has a tank big enough to keep their milk. And you can't keep an apple crop while you wait for prices to change or climb, just like you can't keep your tank of milk while you wait for the milk price to rise. You have to keep it moving out the door. So, when I was hired by Scott Farm, I left another orchard, and I brought boxes of cuttings with me of varieties that I'd collected over the years. I started out doing this in Maine, and then went to New Hampshire. So when I got to Scott Farm, I cut the tops off the Macintosh trees, and I grafted or spliced in twigs of these other varieties. And so back to the phone calling of the produce managers. When I started to call them and tell them, ask them whether they wanted blue pearmains, I knew there weren't 5 other orchardists waiting to sell their blue pearmains. So it put me in the position of being able to tell them what the price was if they wanted blue pearmains. So just like a dairy that's now producing cheese has more control over their destiny or how they market their product. So that's pretty much the key to it, is having something that people like or would like to have, and that not many other. If every other orchard in the East started growing blue pearmains, then we'd be back to the produce managers telling me what they were going to pay for blue pearmains. But until that day happens, then whoever's got blue pearmains gets to set the price. So that's one way that an orchard can be more in control of its future and possible success. And like the Millers, they found that getting the organic certification set them apart from all the other orchards. So if a produce manager wanted organically grown Vermont apples, they had to talk to the Millers. So I'm waiting for Margaret to tell me whether I need to keep going or to...
We would love you to be going. I made the segue from Diana to you so quickly that I guess my question is, and I always love to know what took you on this path down towards becoming a modern day Johnny Appleseed.
Yeah. Let's see. Well, back in the 1970s or so, well, I don't know, maybe this is appropriate to tell the transition people. When I was a teenager, and Martin Luther King Jr. was around, there was something he said that sort of changed the direction, my career path, I guess. And he said, and this was during the 60s, some of you remember, he said, "When evil men shout ugly words of hatred, good men must commit themselves to the glories of love." And so since that time, I've been trying to figure out, how do you commit yourself to the glories of love? And I think growing food is one way of doing that. And I started out growing vegetable crops, seed crops, because I thought having regionally grown seeds was the way for a more secure future for New England. And while I was doing that, I came across several abandoned orchards where I used to live, and I made deals with those people. My father had a small orchard, so I knew something about orchards. I made deals with those people. I would prune the trees and take care of the mowing, and in exchange for harvesting whatever I could. And I'd press cider and give them some and sell whatever fruit was marketable. But some of the orchards I went into had purple apples and russeted apples when I went in. And I knew from my reading that, oh, these are black Oxfords and Roxbury russets. And I remember the first time I went into a cheese store as an adult, after having grown up eating Velveeta cheese and cheddar cheese, and being quite amazed at this variety of cheeses. And I thought, having grown up, my father just grew Red Delicious, that's all we had. And we had to, we couldn't have any other apples than the apples that we grew. We had to eat them until they were gone. And so, so when I found these other apples, it was an epiphany. And I thought other people maybe had grown up like me and would love to taste some of these apples. And so I took cuttings from those trees and I started a nursery. And, you know, growing these trees and selling them. And then we moved to New Hampshire and I brought my nursery with me. And then I started to grow fruit as an orchardist, or taking my cuttings with me. So, did that answer the question, or did I ramble around?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking that you were so inspired by Martin Luther King, and I'm seeing some young people in the audience here tonight, and I'm wondering, what advice would you have for them if they said, you know, oh, I listened to Zeke and he followed his bliss, pardon that awful phrase, but you know, is there room in the world today for someone? I mean, is it possible in Vermont for a person with a certain amount of grit and love and passion for apples to say, yes, I'm going to do this, and are there more varieties out there?
Oh yes, I think if I were to do it over again, I would, you know, the idea of having an orchard and having the expense of tractors and buying the land, fencing, all of that was just too daunting. And I had small children, and all the expenses of raising them. But I think now it seems a very different atmosphere for beginning farmers and aspiring farmers. And so I think a smaller orchard, you know, I think that there's an opportunity for that, a small scale, more diversified operation. So I would encourage any young person or even midlife crisis person that there's plenty of room.
Zeke, I wonder.
Zeke, I have a question
Yes.
about the varieties and their origin, or where they're being grown. I was at Dutton Farm this morning on Western Boulevard, and I was amazed and surprised to see that they probably have 15 or 20 different apple varieties in there. Do they grow them themselves? Do they
Yes,
buy
I
from
think
Scott?
no. Dutton has an orchard.
Do all of those varieties come from a 25-mile radius of?
Oh, sure. Yeah. They're at the turn of the at the end of the 1800s, there was something like 16 or 18,000 cultivars of apples in North America. So, and there's still hundreds and hundreds still being grown. Yes, and you know, Paul Dutton has an orchard, growing lots of different varieties, and Green Mountain has quite a few. You know, Green Mountain's more an example of using that dairy farm analogy, one where, you know, they're big and produce volume, and that's, you know, they've diversified some and are doing more retail, but they're one of the more successful, you know, big orchards still, and in part because they can produce so much.
I want to ask you about orchards in relationship to some of the things that we're thinking about in transition, especially food security, local orchards and especially heirloom apples, and anything else that's related to sustainability in terms of energy and in terms of the local economy.
Well, I think having a little backyard orchard is pretty nice. You can use dwarf trees, dwarf rootstocks, which keep the trees small. To have your own little, if you have some land or can have some land that you can share with someone, a small little orchard. There are some apples that are disease resistant. I tell people who want a backyard orchard that peaches and pears are the easiest trees to grow and actually get fruit. Deer don't like to browse on peach trees, so if deer are a problem, then you might have a peach tree or two in your future. So a few trees in the backyard and maybe some raspberries or blueberries and rhubarb for earlier in the spring might be good. Drying apples. The evaporation trade used to be a big business in the Northeast when apples were dried. They didn't have controlled atmosphere and the ethylene inhibitors that allow some farms to keep apples throughout the year or several years. Apples were put in root cellars, but ones that didn't store well were cut and evaporated. And I guess we're going to have some information about that.
Yes, we are. So, does anybody else have any questions for Zoom?
Yes.
Do you have to spray some of the varieties more than others, or?
Well, yes, I'd say probably Macintosh is the one that needs to get sprayed the most. And that was planted more because it was a cold, hardy variety. After the Baldwin trees were killed, for the most part, back in the 1930s, when there was a really sharp freeze, they replanted with Macintosh trees, which is a Canadian variety. And about that time, chemical spraying was coming more into practice, and so they were able to manage the diseases, the fungal diseases that it's susceptible to with spraying. So, yeah.
How's climate change affecting you?
Well, it's been this past season. We've had the year before last, we had another early spring where the trees bloomed a month earlier than usual, and this year the same thing. And then we got the hard freeze that damaged lots of blossoms. But since I've started this, I track degree days so I can monitor for insects and disease pressure. And over the last 30 years, I've noticed consistently how we're getting warmer in the spring sooner. We're accumulating more degree days earlier in the calendar year than when I first began. Staying warmer later into the fall. We're still picking apples, or we just stopped picking apples. If we still had some apples, we'd still be picking them. But gee whiz, by 20, 30 years ago, we couldn't even think of picking apples at the end of October. It's too cold. But the season's extended in both directions.
By how much?
Maybe not for the better. Some apple varieties tend to do a little better. Some maybe not quite so well.
But insects.
We had a problem with an insect I've never
Seen before.
even noticed before this year,
What was it
and I
called?
think it was due to the heat that we had.
What was it?
A stink bug.
Oh,
It was, the green stink bug, not the marmorated stink bug, but just looks like a green shield beetle or stink bug. And I've seen them before, but never paid attention to them. This year they caused quite a bit of trouble. And the chipmunks and squirrels. So,
Yeah. Zeke, could you talk a little bit? Could you talk a little bit more about the different approaches you've taken to like the integrated pest management and how you...
Sure,
and also-
my timekeeper says...
You're fine.
Oh,
I guess
We're
I have a
mesmerized.
question. It sounds like you're really a great observer of like the temperatures and the
Yes.
conditions, and I'm wondering
That's what...
how you,
Integrated pest management.
Well, you
yeah,
know,
how you came to the conclusions that you did and tried what you did.
well,
and how you figured
early
it out.
on when I first started managing orchards, I found out, to a certain extent, the less I sprayed, the less I had to spray. And I, over the years, you know, maybe Margaret as my mentor, I think of myself as a shepherd of the trees. And the more I just leave the trees alone, you know, they're grazing sunlight. And the less I'm in there chasing them around, mucking around with what they're trying to do, I think the happier they are. I really just have to be out on the lookout for wolves. But otherwise, they're, you know, they're doing what they are supposed to do. I guess my goal in managing an orchard is to enhance the biodiversity of the orchard. It can be an orchard that you plant and the trees are there for generations. You can have incredible amount of biodiversity, insect, different plants growing under the trees. So you can have a very complex ecosystem and a very stable ecosystem, so you're less prone to have pest explosions or population fluctuations. The more stable those insect communities are, the less damage you get. I have all the pests that a normal orchard would have, but they're not causing, because they simply can't, in an insect-rich environment, they can't, their populations just simply can't expand to overwhelm the other or insects there. So that's something that I've learned over the years.
How do you encourage that insect-rich environment that you're talking about?
Well, every time you spray, whether it's an organic spray or a synthetic spray, you're really putting the biological diversity of, especially the insects, back to ground zero. And that's where you create conditions that are ripe for explosions of populations. So the less you muck about, the happier everybody is.
Well,
Can I? Oh.
More questions?
no, you're fine, you're fine.
What's the theory on pruning?
The theory on pruning is to manage sunlight. So you're helping those pomological sheep just to utilize sunlight better. To create fruit buds needs strong, full sunlight. And so if the tree becomes shaded, begins shading itself, then the only place where the fruit buds will grow are on the very outside of the tree. And so the tree has to keep on getting bigger and bigger to maintain a fruit. And so you run out of space eventually.
Well, I think we have time for one more question. Zeke has had a very long day. This is his big season, so.
Yeah.
There you go.
I want to ask about seed banks, because you're growing some sounds like very rare heirloom apples. Are you contributing or creating your own seed bank for these?
There are several places where that are germplasm repositories for apple stock, pear stock. And one of them is in Boylston, Massachusetts, the Tower Hill Botanical Collection. Used to be the Worcester Horticultural Society. And they've maintained an orchard of hundreds of varieties for many years, and they, as a fundraiser for each year, they sell scion wood, or their cuttings. So that's one place.
The seed isn't used much in apple production, seed itself, because you have to have...
Right, seeds are a result of cross-pollinization.
Right.
So
So
every
it's-
time you plant a seed, you'll get an apple tree, but you don't know what the characteristics of the fruit will be.
Right.
So you do it by cloning.
Right. Well, thank you, Steve and Diane.
Very well.
So for those of you who don't feel like you could write a poem about an apple tonight, or bake a pie, and you're not up to keeping an orchard, there's an easier way to do this. There's another way to enjoy apples, and Wendy Germain has, I have just observed her making these wonderful dried apples from various varieties of things, and she's really got it down to a good science. It's fairly straightforward and fun to do, and so we're going to hand over to the finished product, the tools, and enjoy listening to Wendy telling us how to do it.
I really got inspired when I moved here a year ago, and I live right by the Scott Farm, and signed up for the apple shares, the CSA, but I'm from the city. I had no idea how many apples I was getting. And, so I had a friend who had dehydrator, and I thought, gee, I'm going to see how this works out. And one of the things I like to do is I would like to pass around some of the apples that I dehydrated. All these apples come from Scott Farm. Not sure about all the varieties, but I would say this was probably Max, John Eagles, and some others. Pass around. Would you pass them around?
Oh, we get
And
to taste them.
And take as much as you like.
Thank you.
So
Lovely.
I learned probably a lot more than I may want to know. This I bought many, many years ago because I was just intrigued by what this was, because this should I'll do a big one. And this is
Shizuka.
Shizuka. Sounds pretty awesome. One of the most important things that I learned about dehydrating apples particularly is that when you use an apple corer peeler, you get a consistency of the thickness so that it helps you to get a better lot of the apples. So for anybody who has never seen one of these, I am still amazed at people who invent these things. So it peels and it will hopefully core, peel, core, and slice. And here we go. Except that it's probably because this is such a large apple. So what you get are these wonderful, kids love these things. So you can see that you get these really consistent, you get the consistency of this. And what I found out, the kids love spaghetti, the spaghetti. What I also found out was that I don't do this for any commercial venture, so I didn't care that by the time I did the apple corer peeler and started putting them in, that they turned brown. I didn't really care. But I got this book, and I would say that Mother Earth News has been probably my go-to website for any number of things. And one was Mary Bell's book on dehydrating all sorts of things, and had all these wonderful handy tips in there. And one of them was that you can dip the apples in a little bit of lemon juice if they're sweet, or if it's a tart apple, a little bit of pineapple juice. So there's, it helps obviously to keep the apples. You'll see some of the apples actually stay a nice kind of more white color. That's the ones that I dipped in a combination of sort of a little pineapple and a little lemon. And then what happens is there are a couple of different, this is what they look like. If you do have any juice, or if it's very juicy, they have a mesh on there so it doesn't stick quite as much. And you just load up all of these with your apples. And the other thing that I've learned that's very important, because I do care about this, is that I dehydrate the apples at a very low temperature. And so people who I know who are interested in raw foods, I usually dehydrate the apples at less than 115 degrees. It takes longer, but I do it at night, and usually overnight, I would say, depending on how, you can tell the moisture in the apples. If they're really juicy, you're going to want them to go maybe as long as 12 hours, 14 hours. But, so it's my preference to keep the temperature low on these, because I do believe that it helps to keep the vitamins and minerals in there. And then you can tell that I tend to like them a little on the chewy side. I don't know, because it's a nice kind of, they're great. This is great in like granola and in soups and breads and things. I just dump them in. People who like them a little crispier, you can just keep letting it go until it gets to the consistency that you like. If you like a chip. I do want to tell you that for any of you who have gone to the natural food stores and you see bags of, many of them are freeze-dried. It's a very different process that they use, that uses what is the cryogenics. It uses a type of a cryogenic technique, so they kind of get these like crunchy berries. You're not really going to get that from dehydrating. And actually, I really started by dehydrating kale. Because I was on a kale kick, and the curly kale that I got from the farm last year, before Hurricane Irene, it was fantastic. So I had started with kale, and then when I had my apple shares, I did that. And are there any questions? Or
How long can you preserve these in a jar like this out of the fridge?
Yeah, I found last year that you can keep them pretty much through the winter. I've passed this along to some of my family members, and one of them has the vacuum sealed bags, and they lasted longer in the vacuum sealed bags than in the glass jars. Those plastic containers, like the Tupperware, it just does not work for some reason. Glass, and I don't keep them in the sun for whatever reason. I think that I keep them in a cabinet. If it was in a cellar, like in a root cellar, the glass preserved ones would probably last even longer.
How did you dehydrate kale?
Well, since we're just switching gears.
Yeah, I mean anything.
You just, I just take the kale, if the stems are too much, I take the kale, put them in a big bowl, and sometimes I just will sprinkle a little bit of olive oil, a little sea salt, sesame oil, and then you just put them on there, and they take very little time. The kale doesn't have anywhere near the water content that apples do, so you can do kale in about 3 hours.
You don't need to cook them either.
No, I never cook the kale.
I have a friend who uses the pilot light in her oven.
Yeah.
So if you don't want to use electricity, she uses, that stays warm enough. I don't know about apples, but we to make like blueberry leathers, you can lay that in your, as long as you have a pilot light in a gas stove.
Yeah.
And we've done some drying, like the acorns. I haven't thought about this, but we've got like a drying rack over our wood stove, and I suspect that we can. I'm sure it's 115. I'm just thinking of ways that people who don't want to go out and buy a dehydrator can probably utilize some of the environments that we already have.
There are, again, on Mother Earth News, which if you go there, there's several people who have built their own solar dehydrators for their backyards. I just want to really caution people because of our natural habitat and the species that are around here. And obviously there's no sun at night, so just remember to bring your solar dehydrator into the house and not leave all the food out. But the solar dehydrators work really well, and if you're ambitious and want to build one, you can. They're really pretty easy.
No special skill required?
Just some hammers and nails, but all the plans and things are on the Mother Earth News. So solar dehydrators do work really well. And I just caution that if you're using like your oven at home, you probably, if you have a gas pilot light, just check and see what the temperature is so that you can kind of judge how long it's going to take. And electric doesn't work. It never goes down low enough. So I burned kale the first time, and that's why I went back to this. Thank you.
Great.